Alfie Stirling is Director of Research and Chief Economist at the New Economics Foundation. Alfie, very good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon.
Welcome to the programme, sir. As a principle, it seems sound, but financially, I mean, this would amount, when you tot it all up, it's more money, more burden, financial burden for the Treasury.
Well, actually, the interesting thing is, on a pure economic basis, this is a pretty sound investment. What really costs the economy is the infection rate of this virus going out of control, because that either means you have to have longer or deeper lockdowns, or it means that the virus ends up overwhelming the NHS, and that completely throws the economy into disarray. Anyway, actually, if you're able to spend money on ensuring that the test, trace, and isolate system works properly, that people actually do isolate after they are reached, and you avoid both lockdowns and a virus that's out of control, that will come back in dividends later on, because the economy will be able to switch back on, warm back up again much, much faster, and those tax receipts will come back in to pay off that initial outlay.
Alfie, interesting you use the word investment, because that changes the tone of the conversation. Is that how we should view this idea, a £500 investment?
I think in this case, it's really clear that spending now, spending today to support people, to isolate and to do the right thing for wider society is absolutely an investment, in the sense that it will reap huge returns, not only in human life, but also actually just in straight up economic terms as well.
But they've given us no indication of how the mechanics of this would work, because we spoke to Dan earlier in Royston. He's on a 0-hours contract. He's been ill for a couple of weeks because of COVID. He applied and received the £500 grant, or payment as it is. But then in terms of his rent, they took it all away from him. So, for someone like Alfie, this would have been a lifesaver had they not taken it away from him. For someone, for example, if it's a barrister and you're asking a barrister to self-isolate for 10 days or 2 weeks, £500 wouldn't buy them a bottle of wine.
No, and I happen to think actually that the proposal that's been leaked is not the best way of achieving this. I mean, look, if you step back, we've got a clear problem. 18% of people that have symptoms are not self-isolating. Despite the lockdown, we've seen the infection rate barely fall, and that's because we know people are working during this lockdown because they have to. We know that our sick pay is one of the weakest sick pay schemes among advanced economies in the world, and that also applies to our unemployment benefit system as well. And so I think the way to achieve this is to pull the levers we've already got. Rather than paying people a discretionary payment if they get a positive test, just make sure that our safety net gives the economic security it's supposed to do that. And there are three main ways you can do that. Number one, raise sick pay to the level that it needs to be so that people can afford to isolate. So rather than creating a new £500 payment, make sick pay at a comparable level. Number two, the furlough scheme. Why not make it easy for employers to automatically put someone on furlough for 10 days? Because of the positive test results, so make a positive test result a trigger, if you like, for furlough. And finally, universal credit. It doesn't pay enough. And if you want to make sure that people, irrespective of what their job is, whether they're in or out of work, can afford to isolate, make sure that universal credit pays people sufficiently. And New Economics Foundation has proposed to do just that, raising that main payment of universal credit to £227 a week as part of a minimum income guarantee.
But there have been plenty of political discussions about universal payments, of course, and universal credit, because then it becomes, although the government will argue, and rightly argue, they've put a lot more money into it, it becomes a politically ideological conversation. But the idea of raising the average pay for people who are unable to work because of sickness from £95 to £500, would that be a relatively easy mechanism to introduce?
All the infrastructure is in place. We just need to increase the level. I mean, we effectively made a similar decision with universal credit, where we increased the main rate by £20 a week. All we're talking about here is the same mechanism, but increasing the value of the payment, and doing that for sick pay and universal credit. I mean, you're quite right to point out that universal credit has gotten incredibly political. In fact, I'd argue that it's that politics that has gotten in the way of saving people's lives in this instance. But the point actually is that the government hasn't really reversed cuts to universal credit. If you compare the current system, even with the top-up, to 2010, we've actually seen only about a fifth of the cuts since 2010 reversed, and even those are only temporary.